guys, and welcome to episode 188 of the OCDstories.com podcast. Now in this episode, I got on Dr. Michelle Witkin. Michelle is a licensed psychologist who specialises in working with children, teens and adults with anxiety disorders. And I wanted to get Michelle on to talk about siblings. So brothers and sisters of those affected by OCD. And she goes into her own story and why she has a special interest in this area. We talk about how OCD can affect the family, how it can affect the sibling, how we can support the sibling who is affected by OCD, and how the sibling can help in their brother or sister's recovery journey, how to potentially involve siblings in recovery, along with much, much more. I think this was a useful topic to cover because I know siblings can be affected. So I hope this helps you if you are the sibling or if you're the parent listening, or the person with OCD and you want to support your sibling as well. I really hope this helps you, and thank you to Michelle for giving her time on this important topic. And also thanks to Chris Bear from the OCD kids movie Unstuck. He helped me with some of the questions for this episode, so appreciate him. And without further ado, here is Dr. Michelle Witkin. On the podcast today, I have Dr. Michelle Witkin. Michelle is a licensed psychologist who specialises in working with children, teens and adults with anxiety disorders. She has a special interest in obsessive compulsive disorder. Welcome to the show, Michelle.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's really good to have you on. So, as you know, I always start with people's, in the case of a therapist, their therapy story. But I also believe that your life has been touched by OCD to some degree, so it'd be great to hear that side of things as well.
Sure. Okay. My therapy story. So it's funny because I didn't set out to be a therapist. That wasn't the plan. Or was my plan to be an OCD therapist. So my plan was I was either going to be an actress or a medical doctor. Medical doctor was what I was going to fall back on if acting didn't work. But I actually I was always too afraid to do any acting. So that was out of the question. So, I started college studying, thinking I was going to be pre-med, and then calculus, physics, and chemistry happened. And I said, wait, what am I doing? I don't want to do this. What do I like? And that's really the first time in my life that I actually thought about what am I actually interested in. And I was fascinated with my psychology courses. So I started doing some research assistant work when I was in college. Interestingly, I was working on social anxiety with one of my professors. And I decided, through taking the classes that I wanted to go to graduate school. So went to grad school, and I was pretty much a general child and family psychologist. After I graduated, I worked in community mental health and worked with a lot of populations that were underserved, people who were really just struggling to get by. And thinking back about it now, I never felt like I was particularly good at anything. What I mean by that is I don't think I had an understanding of how therapy worked and how people got better. And that was kind of missing, I think, from both my training and my ongoing education. So I did a lot of work with developing programs because I could wrap my head around that. What are different ways we can serve people? What's needed in the community? And then ultimately, I had a couple of children and made a decision to take some time off from the community mental health setting to raise my kids. And during that time is when the OCD part started. So my younger son started to show signs of OCD. And actually, this kind of speaks to how much I didn't know about OCD at the time. And I think I knew enough about OCD to be not very helpful, and to know that I probably shouldn't be treating it. And I didn't back then. But he was showing really stereotypical signs uh, stuff we see in the media, washing, tapping, that kind of thing. And that's when I realized it. But the truth of the matter is, if I look back further now, I realize that he was telling me about bad thoughts even younger. So I was really, really lucky because a friend of mine told me she knew a psychiatrist I could call. And I did. And really, really luckily, because I know that it usually takes people, we say, 14 to 17 years to find good treatment. And I happened to hit it right on target at that very first phone call, which is really amazing because I look back on my graduate school textbook. I still hang on to it, and what it has to say about OCD and its treatment is just, it's horrific. So the psychiatrist spoke with me, and he said, I don't think that you need to start with me. I think it's best if he starts with a therapist who does exposure and response prevention. One of my colleagues who is a psychologist does this. And, why don't you start there first?
Yeah.
And that's what we did. And that's where my education began in terms of OCD. And so I was a mom in the room more than anything, really. And I have to tell you, learning what OCD treatment is like when you're sitting in that room as a parent, it's amazing. And going home and doing exposures with your child is not for the weak of heart. It is hard work. And my son's OCD impacted our family to where going out of the house was difficult because he would get so distressed and so upset. I mean, literally, there were times when people would come up and ask me, what can we do, anything to help you? We even had a police officer come up to us one time because he was so distressed. So learned how to do ERP as a mom first, and then his therapist, my son's therapist, kept saying, you need to go to the OCD conference. You need to go to the OCD conference. And it took me 5 years before I was willing to go because I was like, we are living this at home. I don't know that I want any more of it in our lives. But she said, look, you were so good at doing the exposures with him. I want you to go to the conference. So I finally did. And I was amazed. I was amazed at what I was learning. I was amazed at the community. And I left that conference thinking, I need to start advocating. And I wasn't thinking then I'm going to do treatment. I was thinking I want to start advocating because if I, as a psychologist, didn't know what the appropriate treatment was for OCD, or if I didn't know what OCD really looked like, then maybe I can help other parents to know. Maybe I can talk to them. Maybe I can talk to the schools. Maybe I can talk to pediatricians because kids deserve appropriate treatment and they deserve to be identified. And so once I started doing a little bit of advocacy, then one of my colleagues called me one day and she said, will you please, please, please see this child? And I said, oh, okay. And I let this family know, you're the first family I'm working with this. And I loved the work. I really loved the work. And this patient got better. And I went, okay, I need to get in. I need to retrain. And so that's when I dedicated myself seriously to treating OCD.
Oh, wow. That was awesome. And how long ago was that?
Let's see. He was diagnosed in 2006. And my first OCD conference was 2011, and it was shortly after that I first started treating it.
Oh, wow. You haven't looked back since?
No, not at all. In fact, I said before, I didn't feel like I was effective or I knew what helped. And I feel like, wow, I really feel like I understand what can help people. And I get to see people's lives made better all the time. I love this work, and I can't learn enough about it, frankly.
No, yeah, absolutely. That's wonderful to hear. And I'm curious, so when you said about your son had sort of early worrisome thoughts long before, I guess, it fully morphed into OCD, What were some of those worries about? Were they just sort of general, normal sort of childhood worries that had been amplified, or were they kind of OCD-like in the sense that they were quote unquote weirder than normal concerns?
Yeah, so I remember a couple of things. I mean, one, I would say this is why I was able to dismiss this as just a childhood worry. He came to me several occasions. This is when he was around 5, and he would say, "Mommy, I have a bad thought in my head. Will you make it go away? Help me make it go away." So, like any caring mom, I helped distract him.
Yeah.
Which probably wasn't the right thing to do, right? But I didn't know to do anything else, and he would go on his way. But there was another time when he and his brother liked to draw and make little stories, and he had drawn something, and he would just be sitting at the table, and there would be tears running down his face, and he wouldn't tell me what was going on. And finally, one day, I begged him to please tell me what was happening. I thought, well, maybe someone had heard him or something. And he said, I copied something that I think is a trademark, and I'm afraid that I'm going to have to go to jail now that you told me, or now that I told you. And that to me is very OCD-like to think that.
Yeah, it's very far-fetched, right? Yeah, no, fascinating. Yeah, thank you for sharing. That was my own curiosity because I'm training with children, so I'm always trying to learn. Okay, no, thanks for that. And, your personal experience with this, and then obviously already being a psychologist, but then training in specifically OCD, I'm sure gives you a real unique skill set when speaking with parents and with children with OCD, because you've been through it as a family yourself. So you're not just, I'm guessing you're not just talking to them as Michelle the psychologist, you're talking to them as Michelle the parent as well. Right.
I'm talking as both and as the parent who not only has been through it, but still goes through it, right? Because we know that OCD has a lifetime course. And it's also in my extended family as well, so I can talk about it on many different levels. So, but what's interesting is I didn't realize that until later either, that it was in the extended family. So yeah, I think that it really helps when I'm sitting in the room, especially with parents, and they're struggling. They're struggling to do exposures. They're struggling with their own emotions. And I remember one time this one mom looked at me, and it was so powerful because she said, "You really get this, don't you?" And that was, I'm so glad that she felt that way.
Yeah, absolutely. As I'm sure you were equally relieved when you first spoke to that one clinician who kind of got it. It's a great thing to offer people.
Absolutely. And I think also, parents sometimes are really hard on themselves because, look, usually the parents of these kids who have OCD, very frequently, they may have OCD themselves, or they may have an anxiety disorder, and if not at disorder level, they certainly deal with anxiety. I've found that to be true almost universally with everybody that I work with. And they will be super hard on themselves about trying to follow through with what they're learning in therapy. And I'll look at them and I'll say, "You're not supposed to be perfect," And I'll use myself as an example sometimes. I'll say, I don't do things perfect. You should see me at home with my kids. So, yeah. So I think that it helps to have that.
Absolutely, yeah. It's incredibly hard to notice OCD as a parent. Even with all the information in today's age, like people with OCD, at least historically, I know I did a wonderful job of hiding it. Because it felt like my life depended on hiding it. Hence why it can be called the secret illness. So yeah, it's tough for parents. Okay, so the main thing we're gonna talk about today is siblings, and how siblings, brothers and sisters, are affected by their brothers or sisters' OCD. Before we get into that, just a question, and you have talked about some ways, but just a question around how does OCD affect the family as a whole? Or how can it affect?
Well, it can affect the family as a whole in a lot of different ways. I mean, so it's really uncommon that a family will say it doesn't affect them at all, but I think there are some families that will say that. But in general, it can affect the family by people changing their behavior for the OCD, right? We call this accommodation, which I know that you've talked about with your guests in the past. Things like families change, not doing certain things because it's going to upset the person who has OCD, and they don't want to have them get upset. So maybe they won't go certain places, or maybe they won't bring certain things into the home. The family can do things like they end up doing things for the person, the child who has OCD. So maybe they'll dress that child because that child can't touch themselves, or they'll cut the food and give it to the child because the child won't touch their own food. Parents can end up changing their schedules and missing work because they're busy dealing with OCD. But then there's just also a lot of emotional toll too that can happen. Just people can be overwhelmed. On the one hand, they can just feel so much care and worry about this child who's suffering and struggling, and then on the other hand, there can be so much anger, like, why are you behaving this way?
Yeah.
You know, so it can be all over the place, and everybody in the family is kind of witness to what is this that's going on, and everybody on one hand knows it's not logical what's happening, and then on the other hand, they just want to support their family member and also get frustrated with them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good point on the emotional toll. And yeah, like you said, sometimes parents may snap, and it's really hard to keep that cool with the person you love, because when you worry about them, etc., it can easily turn into frustration, and then frustration releases via snapping.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is what I hear from parents that they feel the worst about, is when they do snap, right? Because they love their child, they don't want to do this, but they've reached the end of what they feel capable of doing.
Yeah, it's a tough one, right? But we're all human, and we
exactly
need to look after ourselves. And I'm pretty sure I have anyway, talked about self-care for parents and stuff on the podcast, so hopefully they've heard that. Okay, so specifically then with siblings, how does OCD affect the sibling?
So I kind of think about it in three different realms. There's probably more, but this is just the way that I look at it. I see that they're affected emotionally, behaviorally, and experientially. And so emotion-wise, before I get into this, I want to say that there are some siblings who will say that they're not affected at all. Okay. And that absolutely can be the case. I suppose. I mean, I grew up with a sibling who had OCD and never knew that sibling had OCD. So I guess it affected me, but I don't know exactly in what ways, right? Because he was hiding everything he was doing. But so it can range from, well, very minimally, but emotionally you can see things like they can be angry, like, why is my brother or sister behaving this way? And they're taking away from things that we do as a family, and they can be frustrated. I also see fear. Right? Oh my goodness, what is happening? What is this? What happened to this sibling that I know? And also, will I get this? And also fears of, am I going to be responsible for this sibling when they get older? Right? This is something that some siblings turn around in their head. There can be jealousy, because their brother or sister with OCD it takes a lot of the family's attention. So it's like, why are they getting all of this? Definitely, there can be a lot of grief. Right? My own son shares when he talks about feeling like he lost his best friend, and it was a really big deal to him. Feeling lonely because everybody else is seemingly paying attention to this and not to them. And then, experientially, there can be things going on in their lives, like their friends are noticing what's going on, and they'll ask them, like, what's up with your sibling? And they may even feel judged, right? Like one young man that I worked with, I remember there was a group of them playing video games, and the older brother's friends were there, and they were like, "Dude, what's up with your brother?" Right? Which made the brother feel really uncomfortable. And like he had to explain. And then there's a lot of times, this happens more with older siblings, where adults will actually come to them and ask them to handle situations with their sibling. And this is when I find troubling, because now the sibling will end up getting pulled out of class or out of activities by a counselor, a teacher, etc. And they're asked, well, what do we do to help your sibling? And it puts them all of a sudden into this kind of caretaker role, which none of them asked for, and frankly, they're not usually prepared for. They can also really be watching their family getting upset. So there this experience of a lot of turmoil in the family. Or there could be the experience, I've heard siblings talk about, of there's a lot of conversations going on behind closed doors about something, and I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
And then there can be the, I'm getting taken to therapy. It's his problem or her problem. Why do I have to do this? And then, behaviorally, of course, they can get involved in accommodation like anybody else. Now, this is an interesting thing. We had a panel at the OCD conference on, it was a bunch of siblings talking about their experiences. And one of the issues that came up is that most of them trigger their sibling with OCD on purpose sometimes, right? Okay. Like pissed off at their sibling. So, hey, you're bugged by me picking up my foot and putting it in your direction. I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
Right. They may act up themselves because they're struggling. Something else that's also kind of common is they will try not to be a problem. So they may sort of disappear a little bit into the background. This is not an OCD thing, but I keep thinking about the book and the movie Wonder. You familiar with that?
I haven't actually read or seen it, but I am familiar with it.
Yeah, so so basically it's about this little boy who's born with a number of developmental kinds of issues, and he's had many, many surgeries, and he looks very, very different. And so the family's always having to go to surgeries for him. And so there's an older sister, and what she does is she hides what's going on with her. She's struggling with something, but because she knows her family is dealing so much with her younger brother, she doesn't want to be a bother. So the family has no idea she's going through something of her own. And I think that happens sometimes in these families with OCD. The sibling without OCD will be like, well, I don't want to be a problem, so I'm going to not bug them about this stuff.
Yeah, it makes sense. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you for that. That was really detailed. There was definitely some ways I wouldn't have thought of there, so that's great. Well, great for clarity, not great. The sibling goes through it.
Yeah.
So then, before we get on to the brother or sister with OCD, there's a long list of some potential ways it can affect the sibling. So how can we being, I guess, other family members, therapists, parents, support that sibling who's being affected?
Chris Bear, who did the movie Unstuck,
yeah.
he sometimes refers to the siblings as the forgotten child. And I think that what that makes me think of is that we want to remember that child. We want to remember the siblings in the family who don't have OCD too. As much as we need to pay attention to the child or children who have OCD, we want to remember that the other siblings are there and that they need our attention too. And I think one of the first most important things is checking in with them. How are you doing with this? Giving them a lot of space to talk. And they might not want to talk initially, but I think letting them know that it's okay to talk. When I I've been running sibling groups at the OCD conference since about 2014, and also done a couple of sibling panels. And I think that the sibs didn't even realize that they needed to talk at first. And it is amazing how some of them stood up and said, wow, like had no idea that there was so much going on, that other siblings felt like I did, and we need to do this more. So I just think that giving them the space to be able to talk with their parents or with somebody, if they sometimes siblings need to talk with a therapist themselves, and that's something that as parents are concerned, others we can always just consider. I think that we need to give them information. So a lot of siblings have told me that they don't understand what's going on, or no one's told them what's going on. They just see this stuff that looks really weird happening in their home, and they just don't get it, and they've got a lot of questions. So they need good information. What is this OCD thing? Well, what's going to happen? What's the treatment that my sibling is getting? Are they going to get better? It's really important. I think that we say knowledge is power, right? And I think for siblings, it's very, very important. I think that they need time with their parents. That's not OCD time, because OCD can become the big picture in the family. And, I know in our case that there were times when OCD took up so much space that my son didn't necessarily feel like there was anything except OCD. And so it's important for us to remember, let's make sure that we're doing something with them that's, not OCD related. Let's read a story together. Let's take a walk together. Let's have dinner together. Something, with mom and dad that's not about the OCD. And then they also need their own time to do their own activities. Sometimes what'll happen is that everything gets abandoned with the treatment going on. And so it's important to remember the sibling has interests and to encourage them to do things that they like. So whatever that might be, a sport, an art, writing, whatever, but making sure that they're doing things that are their own. And then I also think that it's important for them, not every sibling will want to do this, but if they want to help, siblings can be amazing helpers in this fight against OCD, right? Like I've had siblings come into treatment together, and one sibling is like, well, how can I help? And it's like, well, it can teach that sibling how to talk back to OCD. And sometimes they are the greatest allies. Like I remember one set of siblings where they would be at school, and the sister she'd notice her sister was having an OCD moment, and they had an agreement that there was like a little code word she would give her, and that would bring her out of her rituals and remind her to stand up to her OCD. And so they can be amazing, amazing allies.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Which is actually my next question, which is how can the sibling help in their brother or sister's recovery?
It's funny because one of the first things that just came to mind is, okay, so what doesn't help is when you trigger your sibling on purpose. So some siblings, they have this feeling that, okay, if I just go ahead and I just trigger them on everything, they'll get over this thing right away. And that doesn't help, right? Getting someone to do exposures that they don't want to do. So I think that they need to have the information, okay, what doesn't help. But ways that they can help, it can be as simple as go into therapy with your brother or sister's therapist and learn about what's going on. If the sibling with OCD will allow it, right? Not every sibling with OCD wants their brother or sister in their treatment. But if they will allow it, go in there, learn. So just having the information can be helpful. And if the sibling won't allow them in there, then get information from another therapist who understands OCD, right? Another way that they can help beyond just getting information is they can learn about what accommodation is and learn ways to begin not accommodating with their siblings' permission, of course. Um, and then finally, they can actually, like I was mentioning this already, they can really help do exposures. Um, my own son had a thing with insects at one point, and what they would do is they would go out. He and his brother would go out in the yard together, and they would find ants. And together they would go and they would look at the ants. And then they would go and touch the ants and put them on their fingers and they'd let them crawl up their arms. And this is something that actually my son was better at doing than I was, doing exposures with his brother, because different relationship, right? He looked up to his big brother, and so he wanted to please him. So they can be great allies doing exposures together.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Yeah, okay, brilliant. And I guess this is more of a general question then, which is, what would you advise families do if the sibling... Oh, no, sorry, not general question. I'm jumping ahead of myself. This is a more specific one. So what would you do? What would you advise families do if the sibling completely removed themselves from OCD and their sibling with OCD? So basically, the sibling doesn't want anything to do with OCD or their brother or sister with OCD.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely see that showing up, and I think it's one of those things. It's like, what do you do when you have someone who doesn't want to be in therapy? Right? Similar kind of a question. I think that you have to meet that sibling where they're at, and for me as a therapist, when I've had siblings, because I generally invite siblings in to therapy all the time. You want to learn about your brother or sister's OCD, but then and a lot of the kids take me up on it. But there are a certain group of them who are like, don't want to have anything to do with this, right? So then what I do is, for myself as a therapist, I extend an invitation, like, okay, well, you are welcome in here anytime that you want to know anything at all, and here's my number, and here's how you can contact me, and I can help get you information. I even, if I have the opportunity, I will go and I will meet the sibling if they show up in the waiting room. Or I had one sibling who wouldn't get out of the car, and I said, well, let me just come and say hello, and is that okay? And so I, went down to the car and said hello, just so that they had an introduction to me, and I'm not such a scary person. But so that's about it in therapy. But in terms of families, I think that you have to be very accepting. If a sibling is saying that they just don't want to have anything to do with this, well, if that's possible, maybe give them the space and let them know, well, okay, it's here for you if you want it, and here's information. I fully believe in lay information out, put it out around the house, so that they can interact with it if they choose to. But I think it has to be something that the sibling, ultimately, it is going to be best if it's something that they want to come to themselves, right? Now, somebody raised this at the conference, and that is, well, what about if the sibling is a target of the OCD, right? Because sometimes what happens is the sibling, the OCD is so wrapped up in the sibling, like the sibling is a source of contamination in some way, let's say, right? And the child who has OCD really needs to be able to do exposures around that. I think then we need to work a little bit harder to get that sibling involved. But I would say then, like, let a therapist help you to work to get that sibling involved, to help to get them to be motivated to participate, so that they can see what it's got, and to benefit them.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess also what came to me was when the sibling gets involved with therapy, that may give them a sense of meaning and involvement as well in the family. Even if it is to do with OCD, it's they're taking part in it. They're not kind of a bystander anymore.
I think that you're really right about that. It's really empowering. When you think about it, OCD can be so confusing and scary, especially if you're a child, right? It's scary when we're adults, but especially when you're a child. And to have a sense of there's something I can do, it feels really good to feel like you can be helpful.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And in your therapy, have you ever done anything to kind of repair any, I use the word in speech marks, sort of damaged or broken sibling relationships? Is there anything you do to try and reconcile, or is that again kind of giving both parties their space?
Well, it's been kind of rare that
Yeah.
I've had siblings who were not willing in some way to engage, right? Even
Yeah.
if it was, I just want to hear your side of the story. By the way, that's another way too to get a sibling involved. Say, we know you have information that nobody else has, and know that this is really affecting you. So if you can share it, then maybe we can make it better for you, right? But yeah, so when I've had siblings come in where, they're really struggling with each other. And in general, though, they've been willing to come into the room. And this is where I, I, I remember one time, there's a story coming to my mind, and it's making me laugh a little bit, because I had these siblings in my office, and they were really frustrated with each other. And the one who had OCD looked at his sibling and he said, "Well, you just don't know what it's like to have OCD." And the one who didn't have OCD said, "Well, you don't know what it's like to have a sibling with OCD." And then they looked at each other and they started to laugh. and 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 then we could actually have a conversation about how it was hard for both of them.
Yeah.
And how they could help each other and get their own space. And I think it was just that willingness to be in the room together and to start to recognize that they were both struggling, and that they each were allowed to have their own feelings, but that they could respect each other and find a way to make this work together. And so that a lot of times that's what needs to happen, is just being able to be in a room together and hear each other's stories and accept that each other is having a tough time, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like, how do we resolve any kind of place where we're at a standstill, right? We have to be willing to come together.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, it's kind of finding that common ground.
Exactly, which is, what we did something for siblings at the conference that we actually called Common Ground. I think common ground is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so now's one of my more general questions around siblings. So you've definitely answered this already, but this is more of a, someone's just come up to you and asked you this, so you've only got, say, a minute to give them an answer or as much information as you can, which is, what advice do you have for any brother or sister of someone with OCD listening?
What advice do I have with anyone who has a brother or sister with OCD?
Yeah, so what advice to the siblings do you have?
I think it's a two-parter. One is learn whatever you can about what this thing is that's going on, because the more that you know, the less scared, frightened, etc., that you're going to feel. That would be the first one. Learn everything that you can find out, whether that be by talking to a therapist, by reading a book, by watching a video, by looking at things online, but learn everything that you can. And the other thing I would say is talk Talk to your parents, talk to your sibling, talk to a therapist, talk to your counselor, talk to your coach, talk to somebody about what is going on so that you get taken care of too. Do not be invisible. Make sure that you have your voice heard.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you know, I'm sorry, I'm
No, go
interrupting
for
you.
it.
Oh, I had this really beautiful thing happen over this past weekend where I mentioned we had this event. It was called Common Ground, and we brought siblings together just to do an activity. And I actually was sitting in the background. It was really run by siblings. But um, at the end of the activity, the siblings didn't want to leave, and I was wandering around in the hallways just waiting for them to break up so I could clean up. And one of the parents came over to me and said, you know, more than anything at this conference, we've really gotten something for our child who doesn't have OCD. And I want you to know that for the first time ever, our child felt empowered to talk to us, and we learned what it's like for them.
Mm.
And our child is empowered, and nothing greater could have come out of this for us. And so I'm so happy that at least one sibling walked out of there talking for the first time.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly profound, and to be heard at any age is important, but especially as a child. Yeah, no, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. Was that because I know one of the support groups for siblings was like overrunning by about half an hour. Was that one?
Yeah, it was just a getting to know you kind of activity, and it went on for 45 minutes after it ended.
Wow. That's awesome. Okay, so then similar question then is just what advice do you have for any parents listening?
Any parents? Well, the first thing I would say is please be kind to yourself, because this is a challenging disorder to be experiencing for anybody. So just be kind to yourself. You're not going to do it perfectly. And as much as you're going to be really needing to shore up and learn everything you can to help your child who has OCD, remember that the other children in the family are still there, and that they need information. They need your time too. Divide and conquer if you can. I think that that's something that my husband and I learned we needed to do, divide and conquer. And meaning give attention to one of the siblings while making sure we're taking care of the other. And give lots of opportunity for talking and sharing, and take care of yourself in all of this too, right? Because I'm saying you're going to have to look after the child who has OCD. You're going to have to look after the children who don't have OCD. Remember to take space to take care of you. And that may need to come first sometimes. You know, sometimes parents look at me and they'll say, but my child needs this and my child needs that. And I'll say, well, you're not going to be able to take care of them if you're not taking care of you. So maybe your best move is not to step in at this particular time. Do what you need for you so you can be strong, and then you can step in there and then take action.
Yeah, good point. Okay, so change of direction now. So if you could pick up the phone and call the 20-year-old Michelle, what would you tell her?
I would say you have no idea where you are going to go, but just go with it, okay? Be open to it. I would say I'm not even going to tell you what it is that you're going to do, because you're not going to believe it, but be open to the experience, and it is going to be so gratifying and enriching.
Awesome. And you've got a billboard where you live. What do you want written on that billboard for everyone to see?
Billboard. I heard you ask this to someone else, and I thought about it, and I never thought of what my answer would be. Billboard. everybody is struggling with something, so be kind to each other.
Absolutely. Cool, thank you. And is there anything else that I haven't asked you on this topic, or anything else that you wish you could have shared today?
There's one more thing that I did forget to say, and that is sometimes in homes where one child has OCD and the others don't, the children who don't may sometimes find themselves intruded upon by the OCD. And I've seen this be just really hurtful to some of the kids who don't have it, where literally they don't have a safe space in the house. And so I just want to say it's so important that the siblings feel like they do have safety and protection, and we just want to keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, thank you. I think this was a really important topic that needed to be addressed on the podcast. So thank you for giving your time and expertise.
Well, thank you so very much for giving time to this topic. It's definitely a passion for me and for several others I know. So I'm really glad that it's being given attention on this podcast.
So there you have it. I hope that helps, and thank you to Michelle for her time. I thoroughly enjoyed the topic and conversation. And all the show notes will be at theocdstories.com. And don't forget, quick disclaimer, this podcast is not therapy, it's not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. Until we speak, take care.